Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, 1801 to 1809, is known for his controversial religious views that differed from the mainstream Christian tradition of his day. Jefferson was a deist, a philosophy developed during the Age of Enlightenment, which recognizes the existence of God but rejects his intervention in everyday human affairs. Deists tend to set aside divine revelation, miracles, and traditional religious doctrines and favor reason and observation of nature as ways to understand God's existence. One of Jefferson's most famous actions regarding his beliefs was the creation of the Jefferson Bible, original title The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. In this project, Jefferson edited the New Testament by removing all references to miracles, resurrections, and other supernatural elements. He focused the text solely on the moral teachings of Jesus. This reflected Jefferson's view that Jesus was a great philosopher, but not divine. Jefferson was also vocal in his support for the separation of church and state. His famous letter to the Baptist Association of Danbury, Connecticut, introduced the concept of a wall of separation between church and state, which later became a fundamental principle in U.S. law. Although Jefferson faced criticism from the religious orthodox of his time, his views influenced the development of religious thought in America. He remains an important figure in history as a proponent of religious freedom and rational thought amidst the dominance of traditional beliefs. Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, 1861 to 1865, had a complex and sometimes contradictory relationship with religion. Although he is often considered religious, his beliefs do not fit into any particular Christian denomination, and many scholars judge him to be a skeptical theist. Lincoln never officially joined any church throughout his life, although he often quoted the Bible in his speeches. As a young man, he showed an interest in skeptical writings, including the works of philosophers like Thomas Paine, who criticized institutional religion. Lincoln even wrote a pamphlet doubting the veracity of Christian dogma, but his friends discouraged him from publishing it, as they thought it could damage his political career. Nonetheless, Lincoln often expressed his belief in divine will. During the Civil War, he began to speak more frequently about God as the source of morality and the destiny of the American nation. One example is in the Gettysburg Address, 1863, where he mentioned God in the context of rebuilding the nation based on freedom. Additionally, in his second inaugural address, 1865, Lincoln delivered a profound reflection on the sin of slavery and implied that the war was divine punishment for the sin. Lincoln's views on religion evolved over time, mainly influenced by personal tragedies such as the death of his son, Willie, in 1862. Although he never belonged to a formal church, he believed in the power of universal morality and God working through historical events. These views earned him the respect of various religious groups, although his beliefs were often considered unorthodox. John Adams. John Adams, the second president of the United States, 1797 to 1801, was a deist and one of the major thinkers of the American Enlightenment. His religious beliefs reflected a blend of Christian tradition and rationalism, but he often criticized religious dogma that he considered unreasonable. Adams was raised in the Puritan Congregationalist tradition in Massachusetts, but he increasingly moved away from Christian orthodoxy during his adult life. He believed that religion was the basis of morality, but he rejected the idea that God actively governed every aspect of human life. As a deist, he saw God as the creator of the universe, working through the laws of nature, not as an entity that intervenes directly in human life. Adams also often denounced what she called superstition in religion. In his letters, especially with Thomas Jefferson, he critically discussed Christian theology, including the doctrines of the Trinity, hell, and the resurrection of the body. These views led him to be considered unorthodox by some of his contemporaries. However, Adams remained respectful of religious moral values. In a letter to the Massachusetts militia in 1798, he wrote, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." His statement emphasized the importance of religion as the moral foundation of society, although he rejected religious interference in government. Adams' spiritual legacy is his view that combined morality, rationalism, and religious tolerance, which became the basis for the principle of religious freedom in the United States. Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, 1829 to 1837, was known for his strong but contradictory religious beliefs. He was raised in the Presbyterian tradition, and although he never formally belonged to a particular church, Jackson often claimed to be a religious man. However, many of his actions, both personally and as a leader, contradict the religious principles he claims to espouse. Jackson believes that God has an important role in people's lives, and he often relies on prayer and trust in the divine will in his decision-making. However, his actions were often seen as far removed from Christian values. One of his most controversial policies was the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which forced thousands of Native Americans to leave their ancestral lands. This policy led to the Trail of Tears, a long, agonizing journey that resulted in the deaths of thousands of people. Many church leaders of the time condemned this policy as immoral and against the teachings of Christian love. On the personal side, Jackson was known as a stubborn, emotional, and sometimes violent individual. He was often involved in duels and quarrels, which showed that his nature was far from the gentleness taught by the church. However, in his old age, Jackson delved deeper into religion. He officially joined the Presbyterian Church shortly before his death. His religious views reflected a blend of traditional beliefs and hard pragmatism, making him a complex and contradictory figure in terms of spirituality and leadership. Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States, 1913 to 1921, was known as a deeply religious president with a unique spiritual outlook. As the son of a Presbyterian minister, Wilson had deep religious convictions from childhood which later influenced many aspects of his life, including his political views and foreign policy. Wilson saw himself as an instrument of God's will in leading America. His belief in providentialism, the idea that God has a special plan for the American nation, was prominent. He believed that America had a moral mission to spread democracy and peace in the world. This view was evident in his rhetoric during World War I, where he described the war as a moral struggle to make the world safe for democracy. However, Wilson's spiritual beliefs were often considered strange or unorthodox, especially as he linked religion to a political mission directly. Many critics claim that his approach is messianic, as if he sees himself as a messenger of God to bring about global change. Wilson also believed in the values of social progressivism combined with Christian principles, a view that was not always accepted by conservative groups of his day. Wilson's domestic and foreign policies, including the formation of the League of Nations, reflected his belief that political action should be based on high moral principles. While his views sparked admiration from some, many found his approach too idealistic and fraught with contradictions between political reality and his spiritual vision. Franklin Pierce. Franklin Pierce, the 14th President of the United States, 1853 to 1857, was a leader with ambiguous spiritual beliefs, often influenced by tragedies in his personal life. Baptized in the Episcopal tradition, Pierce did not actively practice his religion, but his experiences with personal suffering led him to frequently grapple with spiritual questions. Pierce experienced a number of major tragedies, including the deaths of 3 of his young children. The most tragic was losing his 11-year-old son, Benjamin, in a train accident just weeks before Pierce was inaugurated as president. This tragedy greatly affected his spiritual outlook. Although he did not abandon his belief in God, Pierce became increasingly skeptical of formal religious doctrines, and some sources note that he blamed God for his suffering. In politics, Pierce did not openly connect religion to his policies, in contrast to many other presidents. However, spiritual influence can be seen in some of his political decisions. He supported states' rights on the issue of slavery, a highly controversial position at the time, but not based on strong moral or religious arguments. His decisions are often considered pragmatic rather than guided by spiritual beliefs. Pierce also faced criticism for his weak relationship with the church. Although he showed respect for religion, he was often perceived as an unorthodox figure. His life reflected a personal spiritual struggle rooted more in the experience of suffering than doctrinal beliefs. This makes him one of the American presidents whose spiritual views are the most elusive. Millard Fillmore, Millard Fillmore, the 13th President of the United States, 1850 to 1853, had religious views that were unusual for his time. He was a Unitarian, a faith that differed from traditional Christianity. Unitarianism rejects the doctrine of the Trinity, emphasizes the oneness of God, and focuses more on moral teachings and rationality than religious dogma or rituals. Fillmore's belief in Unitarianism reflected a more liberal approach to religion. He rejected the conservative theological views that dominated 19th century America, such as the teachings on original sin and bodily resurrection. As a Unitarian, Fillmore believed that each individual was responsible for his or her own morality, and he placed more emphasis on universal values such as justice, freedom, and social good. Fillmore's attitude towards religion was also reflected in his political policies. He was a strong supporter of religious freedom and the separation of church and state. For example, he rejected proposals to place certain religious teachings in public institutions, including schools. This made him popular among religious minorities such as Catholics and Jews, but he also faced criticism from conservative Protestants. Although Fillmore's Unitarian views were considered strange by much of the more orthodox American society of the time, his tolerant and progressive attitude towards religion reflected broader democratic values. However, his unconventional beliefs and pragmatic policies often made it difficult for him to gain the full support of dominant religious groups. Herbert Hoover, the 31st President of the United States, 1929 to 1933, was known for being religious but unconventional in his beliefs. Hoover was a member of the Religious Society of Friends, better known as Quakers, which has a unique spiritual tradition compared to other Christian denominations. As a Quaker, Hoover lived by the main principles of this teaching, such as peace, simplicity, and service to the community. Quakers rejected elaborate ecclesiastical rituals, religious hierarchy, and violence in any form, including war. This tradition influenced Hoover in his personal life, where he displayed a simple lifestyle and peaceful approach to human relations. However, Hoover faced challenges in bridging his Quaker beliefs with political realities. During his tenure as president, he had to lead the country in difficult situations such as the Great Depression, which demanded harsh economic decisions and were often not directly related to spiritual principles. Although Quakers tend to be pacifists, Hoover had previously been involved in humanitarian affairs during World War I, such as helping European refugees. This shows that he was able to balance his beliefs with pragmatism. Hoover rarely spoke openly about his religion, but he was known for his deeply spiritual views, which focused more on action than rhetoric. For Hoover, religion is about devotion to fellow human beings, especially through charity work and public service. While these views may be considered strange by a more traditional society, Hoover's spiritual legacy reflects personal integrity and dedication to universal human values. Jimmy Carter, the 39th President of the United States, 1977 to 1981, was a deeply religious man, yet his beliefs were often considered unusual, even controversial, by some religious groups of his day. Carter was a Southern Baptist, but he held more progressive and humanist views than the majority of adherents of that tradition, especially on social and political issues. Carter was noted for his deep involvement in his church and religious activities. He was a Sunday school teacher even during his presidency, and to this day he continues to teach after retiring from politics. His beliefs center on the principles of love, forgiveness, and social justice, which he considers to be at the core of Jesus' teachings. However, Carter's views often differed from the conservative views that dominated the Southern Baptist community at the time. He supported women's rights, including access to contraception and gender equality, and supported civil rights for minorities. Carter also criticized foreign policies that did not conform to moral principles, such as support for authoritarian regimes. During his tenure, Carter integrated spiritual beliefs into his administration's policies, including energy, environmental, and human rights policies. However, this approach sometimes led to him being perceived as too idealistic or even weird by his political opponents. After leaving the White House, Carter increasingly focused on charity work, founding the Carter Center, which focuses on peace and poverty alleviation. Carter's bold and often countercultural spiritual views make him a unique figure in American political and religious history. Ronald Reagan, the 40th President of the United States, 1981 to 1989, but was a leader known for his deeply religious views, but with spiritual elements that some might consider strange or unorthodox. Reagan grew up in a family that adhered to the Disciples of Christ Church, but his spiritual views developed to include elements of mysticism and a deep belief in destiny. Reagan often mentioned God in his speeches, and his belief that America had a divine mission as a city on a hill reflected the influence of conservative Christian theology. However, his views were not limited to religious doctrine. He and his wife, Nancy Reagan, were known to be interested in astrology, especially after the assassination attempt on Reagan in 1981. Nancy often consulted astrologers to choose favorable times for political decisions or presidential trips, which became a source of controversy. In addition, Reagan often spoke of fate and God's will as directing his life, including in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. He described the Soviets as the evil empire, and his rhetoric reflected the belief that he was chosen to lead this moral battle. Although his beliefs rested largely on traditional Christian values, his openness to astrology and the way he attributed historical events to spiritual scenarios often led him to be considered unconventional. Reagan combined religion, destiny, and symbolism, making him one of the most unique presidents in his spiritual approach